We urge you to, again, move to shelter and get in your shelter and stay there. A tornado emergency has been declared by the National Weather Service, with Greensburg under the gun of a large and dangerous tornado. So as this continues to unfold, it looks like now we have an updated picture from our KSN high-resolution NEXRAD Doppler radar. Boy, I sure hate to tell you this, friends, but it looks like that thing is right on top of Greensburg. So your time is up. You need to be in your shelter right now. It is 9:47, and the arrival time at the very latest will be 9:50, so you should be in your...
On May 4, 2007, a 1.7-mile-wide EF5 tornado completely leveled the small town of Greensburg, Kansas. The damage was unimaginable and 11 people were left dead. As tragic as this was, this storm was far from being over, and the Greensburg monster would not even be the most impressive thing about it. This singular storm would go on to produce at least 22 separate tornadoes, including at least one tornado that was bigger and likely stronger than even the Greensburg EF5. This is the story of the May 4th, 2007 tornado machine. The story of the Greensburg supercell begins roughly 5 days before, on April 30th. On this day, forecasters at the National Weather Service began to notice the possibility for a severe weather outbreak to occur during the back end of the first week of May. In turn, they issued their first outlook on this day, which highlighted a large area consisting of 5 states. On the next day, that highlighted area was narrowed down slightly to this area. On May 2nd, a slight risk was introduced with a 15% chance of severe probabilities. On the next day, the slight risk stayed, but the risk had been increased to 30%. And by the morning of the event on May 4th, the National Weather Service pulled the trigger and upgraded to a large moderate risk area with a 15% chance of strong tornadoes in the bullseye. When we take a look at what atmospheric conditions were at play to allow for this risk, we find a classic severe weather setup. At 500 millibars, or roughly 20,000 feet, a relatively strong trough began to eject into the plains, bringing with it 30 to 50 knot winds. Much lower in the atmosphere at 850 millibars, or just a few thousand feet off the ground, low-level winds were forecasted to be minimal for most of the day, until the low-level jet was forecasted to kick in around sunset. The low-level jet is a near-daily occurrence during the spring and summer, when low-level winds in the atmosphere significantly increase around and after sunset. This is typically caused when the upper levels of the atmosphere cool as the day goes on, which causes a pressure gradient between the cool upper atmosphere and the warmer lower atmosphere. This pressure gradient then results in strong winds flowing from the cool air to the warmer air. This particular low-level jet turned out to be extremely strong, with winds approaching 60 knots at the peak. This would end up going on to supercharge what was about to happen later. In terms of temperature, values rose well into the mid-80s, and dew points also approached 70 along a sharp dry line that had now formed. There was also plenty of energy for thunderstorms, also known as CAPE, in the atmosphere, with values rising well past 4,000 joules per kilogram and even approaching 5,000 joules per kilogram in certain spots. The craziest thing about this setup, though, as classic as it was that it wasn't even the day that people were most concerned about. The following day on May 5th looked to be a much bigger day, and spoiler alert, it was, at least in terms of the amount of tornadoes that occurred. The one big question on May 4th, though, was how many storms would actually be able to form. You see, there was a strong cap in place for most of the day, which would significantly hinder storms from forming. A cap is simply a warm layer of air a few thousand feet up from the ground that inhibits thunderstorms from forming. In an ideal world, for storm chasers at least, a moderately strong cap can actually be a good thing, where it only allows the strongest of storms to develop and keeps everything organized and isolated. However, if the cap is too strong, then storms potentially might not be able to form at all. That was the big question mark on this day, but the cap on May 4th was forecasted to weaken as the day went on, so it was likely just a matter of how long and where storms would be able to finally develop. In reality, the first storm of the day formed along the Texas and Oklahoma border around 5 p.m. and slowly drifted northeast. Shortly after forming, the storm split into two, with the left split now heading almost due north. This is something important to note, and a trend that would continue and come back into play shortly. About an hour after forming, the original storm got tornado warned and shortly afterwards began producing tornadoes. This is also roughly the same time that the National Weather Service issued the first tornado watch for the area, which included portions of Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas until 2 a.m. This storm ended up producing an amazing tornado in Ellis County, Oklahoma, and if not for what was about to happen in just a few hours, likely wouldn't have been so overshadowed. After producing a couple of tornadoes, the Ellis County storm started to weaken as it produced yet another left split that began following in the footsteps of the original one. Although it was unknown at the time, this particular storm was the beginning of one of the most iconic storms in American history. The other interesting thing to note here is that left split storms rarely ever produce tornadoes, which once again makes what was about to happen even more unique. Both storms had moderately strengthened up to this point, but neither were really that big of a deal so far, and were rather disorganized, but that was about to change. As the pair of storms begin to cross over the border into Kansas, the original left split storm dies, while the second left split begins to conglomerate into a more concise and organized storm. Moments later though, this storm would produce another left split, which temporarily put a hold on the intensification process. It didn't take long to get back on track though, as just minutes later re-intensification commenced, and a new storm began to develop on the southwestern side of the conglomerate. This storm quickly began exhibiting tornadic characteristics that none of the other left splits had seen so far, and just 40 minutes after forming was ready to produce its first tornado of the evening. At 8:32 p.m. Central Daylight Time, the storm produces tornado number 1 just to the northeast of Ashland, Kansas. This EF0 tornado tracked northeast, and just 2 minutes later at 8:34 p.m. was joined by a twin. This was also an EF0 that touched down just to the southeast of the original tornado and tracked northwest. Neither of these tornadoes lasted very long, and neither hit anything, which earned them both their EF0 rating. About 10 minutes later at 8:48 p.m., the storm got its act together once again and put down tornado number 3 just to the north of Protection, Kansas. This tornado tracked northeast, and just a couple of minutes later at 8:50 p.m. the storm produced another tornado. This one tracked north-northeast and nearly hit a farmer on a tractor who was just barely able to get out of the way in time. This was the first tornado from the storm that did hit property, as it struck a barn which earned it an EF1 rating. These new pair of twins also didn't last very long and dissipated after being on the ground for just a couple of miles, but the storm was still gaining strength and was about to produce something much bigger. At 9 p.m. exactly, the storm put down tornado number 5, and this one quickly began exhibiting different characteristics than the first 4. This twister was moving in a more northeast direction than the others had to this point, and was quickly growing larger as well. It would continue to strengthen, and very shortly afterwards would begin spitting out satellite tornadoes. The first one touched down at 9:08 p.m. just to the east of the parent tornado. This EF1 tornado only impacted some trees and tracked for just over a mile before lifting back up into the clouds. Once again, just a handful of minutes later, the storm would produce not one, but 2 more satellite tornadoes simultaneously. Both of these EF0s touched down at 9:18 p.m. and stayed over open fields. Both would lift after being on the ground for less than a mile in just a couple of minutes. It was at this point that people began noticing that the tornado looked like it was going to come dangerously close to the town of Greensburg. However, if it stayed on its current trajectory, it looked to pass just east of town, but that's just when something alarming began to happen. At this moment, the tornado began to enter the later stages of its life and began to occlude and start turning more to the north, straight towards Greensburg. As the tornado began to turn to the north, it produced another pair of twins, which touched down at 9:24 and 9:25 respectively. Once again, both of these tornadoes were short-lived and weak, and both earned an EF0 rating before retreating after just a couple of miles. It was at this point that the tornado was approaching its peak width of 1.7 miles wide, and it started becoming increasingly evident that Greensburg would no longer be spared with the new trajectory of the tornado. It was at this moment that the National Weather Service in Dodge City, while watching radar trends and getting phone calls from chasers describing what they were witnessing, decided to upgrade the already ongoing tornado warning to an extremely rare tornado emergency for Greensburg. At this point, all anybody could do was just watch on radar in horror as the storm got closer to town, and one of these people was KSN Chief Meteorologist Dave Freeman.
I urge you to again move to shelter and get in your shelter and stay there. A tornado emergency has been declared by the National Weather Service, with Greensburg under the gun of a large and dangerous tornado. So as this continues to unfold, it looks like now we have an updated picture from our KSN high-resolution NexRad Doppler radar. Boy, I sure hate to tell you this, friends, but it looks like that thing is right on top of Greensburg. So your time is up. You need to be in your shelter right now.
Just before entering town, though, the parent storm put down another set of twins just to the east of the already ongoing tornado. These 2 new tornadoes were rated EF0 and EF1 and tracked northwards parallel to the other tornado as it began to enter the southern side of town. The twister had shrunken slightly at this point down to 1.3 miles wide, which was still wider than the entire town. The incredibly violent tornado passed through the town at the slow speed of just 20 miles per hour, making an already horrible situation last that much longer. After a few minutes though, it would clear town and the satellite tornado off to the east would rope out as well. After clearing town though, the Greensburg tornado continued its occlusion and turn, and performed a large loop and began heading back towards the town from the northwest. Fortunately though, just when it looked like it might hit the town once again, it finally lifted in a field just northwest of town. At roughly the same time and just to the northeast of town, the storm finishes its cycle and produces another tornado. This one touched down at 10:03 p.m. and tracked northeast and also quite rapidly strengthened and expanded. This new tornado looked to be taking another dangerous course though, as it looked like it would come very close to the town of Trousdale. Luckily though for town, the tornado began to occlude and started a hard turn to the north. Amazingly, the same thing that ended up dooming Greensburg would save the town of Trousdale. As the monster passed less than a mile west of town, it grew to a massive width of 2.2 miles wide, or a half a mile wider than Greensburg was at its peak. There's no way of knowing for certain, but there's also a very good chance that this tornado might have even been stronger than Greensburg as well. As the tornado passed Trousdale, it continued its occlusion and weakening trend, while at the same time the storm was cycling again and ready to put down another monster to the southeast. This new tornado touched down at 10:39 p.m. and once again initially tracked northeast. Also, once again, this new tornado had an alarming course, which looked to aim directly for the small town of Hopewell. As Hopewell prepared to take a hit, the tornado made a slight turn to the east, which would ultimately save the town as it passed just a mile and a half to the east. Even though the town of Hopewell was able to breathe a sigh of relief, another person would not be as lucky. As the twister brushed past town, it hit a farmhouse and unfortunately killed one resident who was sheltering inside. The tornado safely passed the town of Hopewell, but now looked to be moving directly towards the town of Maxville, as another unfortunate situation was beginning to develop. At this time, Sheriff Robert Buckman of the Maxville Police was made aware of the approaching tornado and headed out of town to try and storm spot and do anything he could to help as the tornado approached his town. As the tornado grew close to Maxville though, it continued its hard turn and began dying just to the southwest of town. Unfortunately, while Sheriff Buckman was watching this tornado rope out, the storm quickly produced another tornado without him knowing. This new tornado touched down at 11:34 p.m. to the southeast of the dying tornado and moved northeast. It quickly grew in size and intensity and just moments later hit Sheriff Buckman, who never saw it coming and didn't have time to react. His car was thrown 1/4 of a mile away and he was found in a field, and unfortunately he would end up passing away several days later from the injuries he received. Just like the previous 3 tornadoes, this one quickly intensified and grew to almost a mile wide. It reached its max width fairly early on in its life and started shrinking in size shortly thereafter. As it began to shrink, it also started changing directions and began traveling more northwards, as it continued to follow the trend of occlusion that we'd seen with the other tornadoes, and it would eventually rope out just to the west of the town of Hudson. At this point, the clock had passed midnight and the supercell was still trudging on. It looked to be getting slightly more disorganized, but it was not done producing tornadoes just yet. At 12:28 a.m. and just to the north of the town of Hudson, the storm produced its next tornado. Although the storm was still producing tornadoes, it was showing signs of weakening, and this was not nearly as significant as the last 4. It would track almost due north for roughly 6 miles and would produce no more than EF1 damage. The next 2 tornadoes would be extremely brief and weak, with one touching down at 12:48 and then at 12:55 a.m. Both were rated as EF0s and were on the ground for less than a mile in just a minute or two. After these 2 tornadoes lifted, there was actually a grace period of about half an hour that surely made people wonder if this cyclical supercell had finally run out of gas. However, just when people may have thought that the nightmare was finally over, the storm proved otherwise. As the storm passed over the town of Ellenwood and approached Claflin, it produced another tornado. This strong EF1 touched down at 1:21 a.m. and tracked northeast. It tracked for 5.5 miles before eventually roping out just barely south of town. Immediately upon roping out, another tornado was produced just barely to the southeast of the origin point of the last tornado. This one formed at 1:28 a.m. and also tracked northeast and was also rated as an EF1. There's actually a decent likelihood that this tornado was stronger than its indicated rating, as it was noted to have done significant damage to trees along its path. This one traveled for 6.2 miles before it roped out to the southeast of Claflin. A handful of minutes after the last tornado faded away, another one spawned just to the southeast of the last track. This one touched down at 1:46 a.m. and once again initially tracked northeast. About 1/3 of the way through its life, it actually did make a right-hand turn before eventually lifting after being on the ground for 5.2 miles. This one was once again rated as an EF1, having done damage to several sheds and downing numerous power lines. After this, the storm was really starting to fall apart as it drifted northeast, but it still had one last tornado in its belly. At 2:06 a.m. and just to the northeast of Holyrood, the storm put down one last twister. This one was an EF0 and was noted to have knocked down several large trees and a power pole before it lifted after being on the ground for just half a mile. And just like that, this was finally the last tornado that this storm produced. This singular storm produced a mind-boggling 22 tornadoes that spanned over the course of roughly 5.5 hours and 120 miles. That's not even mentioning how long the storm in general was going on for, which was somewhere in the ballpark of 8 to 10 hours. As the sun began to rise on the town of Greensburg just a few hours after the last tornado from the storm was produced, there was utter devastation in its wake. 95% of buildings in town had taken damage from the tornado, with a very high percentage of that being complete losses. After officials finished a head count, it was discovered that the tornado had killed 11 and injured 63 in town. It's also important to remember the other 2 fatalities that other tornadoes from the storm caused, which brought the grand total to 13. While this was a devastating loss, it's quite amazing that both of these numbers weren't higher considering the sheer strength of the tornado and the fact that it hit at night. In all likelihood, the critically dire warnings that were issued by the National Weather Service just before the tornado entered town saved countless lives and prevented an even greater tragedy. And to make matters even worse for those that just lost everything in the Greensburg supercell the previous night, the same weather system was not letting up. Remember that May 4th wasn't even the day that people were most concerned about, it was the next day on May 5th. On May 5th, an extremely rare high risk was issued by the Storm Prediction Center, with Greensburg and surrounding communities finding themselves in the crosshairs once again. The high risk included a 30% chance of strong tornadoes, which was essentially 2 times higher than the risk on the previous day. Unfortunately, all that residents could do was try to begin to pick up the pieces and keep an eye to the sky. As expected, storms formed in the mid-afternoon and quickly began producing tornadoes all over the Central Plains. Shortly thereafter, storms began passing over Greensburg, putting an end to the recovery efforts for the day when suddenly the worst fears began to come true. Just before 6 p.m. local time, a supercell that was heading in Greensburg's general direction became tornado-warned and dropped a tornado about 10 miles southeast of town. This tornado tracked over rural farmland for about 8 miles and was rated as an EF0. This scare would not be the closest call though, as just an hour and a half later another supercell looked to be aiming for the town once again. At roughly 7:30 p.m., another tornado-warned supercell passed directly over Greensburg and put down another tornado less than 2 miles away from town. This EF1 tracked north-northwest for just a mile and a half before eventually lifting. Greensburg would get numerous other storms as the rest of the day and night evolved, but this was the last tornado scare, and it was quite enough. By the day's end on May 5th, 91 total tornadoes were tallied, certifying it as an outbreak. On May 6th, the final part of a 3-day outbreak of severe weather was in order, and once again Greensburg was included in the festivities. Another moderate risk was issued with another 15% chance of strong tornadoes, which were the same probabilities as the first day. It looked more than likely that the activity was going to be centered east of town on this day, but it certainly wasn't convincing enough for residents to be able to carry on without having to worry about it. In reality, though, this turned out to be true, and even though Greensburg got more thunderstorm activity, it was not tornadic. Tornadic thunderstorms were not that far away, though, as a handful of tornadoes were produced near Medicine Lodge, Kansas, which is just 40 miles southeast of Greensburg. Only 14 tornadoes ended up occurring on May 6th, all of which were weak, though. On May 7th, the severe weather outbreak finally ceased and a full-scale cleanup and recovery effort could finally begin. Damage surveyors were brought into town to try and classify how strong the Greensburg tornado was, and they had a new rating system at their disposal. The brand new enhanced Fujita scale was just put into effect 3 months prior, and this would be the ultimate test for it. Meteorologists and engineers meticulously surveyed every single building that was damaged and came to the conclusion that yes, this tornado produced EF5 damage to a handful of buildings in town. Estimated wind speeds in the funnel were calculated to be 205 miles per hour as it traversed the town. This was also a significant rating as it was the first EF5 tornado on the new scale and was the first F5 or EF5 tornado since the 1999 Moore F5 8 years prior. With recovery efforts now fully underway, it became very obvious that this would not be quick or easy, as a vast majority of the town would have to be completely rebuilt. While some residents opted to leave, others took this challenge as an opportunity. Over the course of the rebuilding process, the residents of Greensburg began taking their town name seriously and implemented cutting-edge climate-conscious designs with their new building developments. In addition to this, 100% of the electricity used in Greensburg today is generated by wind energy. In an amazing twist, the very thing that destroyed the town in the first place is now what makes Greensburg one of the greenest cities in the world. While Greensburg has successfully rebuilt in the 18 years since the tornado, it is still very obvious what once happened there. The town is not what it once was, and the population is only 50% of what it was in 2007, and there are still many empty lots visible around town. Either way, the Greensburg, Kansas story is a true testament to the resilience of people when faced with the absolute worst situation that anyone can imagine. Residents vowed not to let a tornado end their town's history and successfully flipped the script on Mother Nature, building their town back using the very thing that destroyed it in the first place.